Good evening once again. As if a nice meal and good conversation wasn't enough, we have the highlight of our evening coming up. It is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce tonight's Crossings and Dwellings Conference keynote speaker, John T. McGreevy, Professor of History at Notre Dame and Dean of its College of Arts and Letters. Dr. McGreevy joined the faculty at Notre Dame in 1997 and served as chair of the History Department from 2002 to 2008. A graduate of the institution he now proudly serves, Professor McGreevy completed his doctoral work at Stanford. He is the author of two books, Parish Boundaries, The Catholic Encounter with Race in the 20th Century Urban North, published by University of Chicago, and the second, Catholicism and American Freedom, a history published by W.W. Norton. Dean McGreevy has received major fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Louisville Institute, the Erasmus Institute. He has published articles and reviews which have appeared in the Journal of American History, Commonweal, the New Republic, and even our own Chicago Tribune, and many other venues. His paper tonight is entitled Globalizing, Rewriting 19th Century American Jesuits. Professor McGreevy, welcome to Loyola University. We are very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you to Father Reagan. Thank you too, and quite sincerely, to the impresarios who have hosted this wonderful conference, this dinner, and this magnificent museum exhibition. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it, certainly not in the small field of American Catholic history, to have that combination of a rich intellectual menu with a conference, an extraordinary museum exhibition, and then the kind of pleasure of this company. So I think we should all give a round of applause to Ellen Scarrett. Here's Ellen. To Kyle Roberts and his students for their magnificent work. And to the many people, as Bob Orsi said this morning, who claim to be Stephen Schlesser, S.J. I do not like the late resurrection of the Jesuits. They have a general now in Russia, in correspondence with the Jesuits in the U.S., who are more numerous than anybody knows. Shall we not have swarms of them here? If ever any congregation of men could merit eternal perdition on earth and in hell, it is this, Company of Loyola. Our system, however, of religious liberty must afford them an asylum. But if they do not put the purity of our elections to a test, it will be a wonder. John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, May 6, 1816. I dislike with you their restoration, because it marks a retrograde step from light to darkness. Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, August 1st, 1816. This society has been a greater calamity to mankind than the French Revolution or Napoleon's despotism or ideology. It has obstructed the progress of Reformation and the improvement of the human mind and society much longer and more fatally. John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, November 4th, 1816. Now, neither the 1773 suppression of the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, by Pope Clement XIV, nor the restoration 200 years ago this year by Pope Pius VII is mentioned in any U.S. history textbook. The suppression forced Jesuits living in French Louisiana, Spanish California, and the British colonies to abandon their missions or adopt new identity as diocesan priests, as we heard in one of the sessions today. It meant much more in Latin America, where 23,000 Jesuits, not just 25, faced this difficult choice as opposed to just a few dozen in the British colonies. But the origins lay in distant squabbles between European popes and the Pope and colonial and monarchs, provoked mostly bewildered comments in North America. The 1814 restoration caused a little bit more comment, including the anxious exchange I just cited from two former presidents. Still, it seems obscure, an archaic event, as odd as the Latin that the Jesuits used in their correspondence back and forth across the Atlantic in the 19th century. In a book I'm just finishing, tentatively entitled 19th Century Jesuits in the United States, a Global History, I argue differently. Now, I say finishing the book, but of course my service as dean has made me very nervous about posthumous publication. In this book, I use a series of case studies, beginning with Jesuits moving from Germany, Italy, France, and Switzerland to the United States. And then in the last chapter, I look at American Jesuits going out to the Philippines. And overall, I try to claim that the Jesuits are central to any understanding of the 19th century Catholic revival and diaspora, a movement of people, institutions, and ideas that altered modern history on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the history of the Jesuits does not substitute for a history of the 19th century Catholic whole, but it comes close. Growing from 600 aged members in 1814 to 17,000 by 1914, the Jesuits moved from the margins of Catholic life in 1814 to its center. By the 1830s and 1840s, the Jesuits are expanding across the world. They're establishing new missions in Syria, 1831, Calcutta, 1834, Argentina, 1836, India, 1837, China, 1841, Albania, 1841, Canada, 1842, Madagascar, 1844, Algeria, 1848, and Australia, 1848. More of these Jesuits, missionary Jesuits, moved to the United States than in any other place. By my count, it's over 1,000 between 1814 and 1900. Now, in part, they simply followed the Catholic tide, a tide that's so revealingly displayed in that museum exhibition. The Catholic portion of the great migration out of Europe in the 19th century, one of the great human movements in human history, roughly 60 million people. The Catholic portion of that was over 30 million. And these Catholic migrants journeyed to Britain, Australia, Argentina, and beyond, but the biggest group left Europe for the United States. And so in the 1840s and 1850s alone, about 2 million Irish come to the United States, and they're about 90% Catholic. About 2 million Germans come to the United States, and they're about half Catholic. Catholics are 3% of the American population, we think, in 1840. They're about 20% in 1900. Now, so in one sense, the Jesuits simply follow that Catholic tide. In another sense, and I'm going to return to this, they are expelled from Europe by liberal governments, convinced, and deeply so convinced, that a global religious order deeply loyal to the papacy threatened the stability of new nation states. So the unexpected result is that by the 1870s, Jesuits from Turin worked in San Francisco and among the Blackfeet Indians in Montana, Jesuits from Naples in New Mexico and as professors in Maryland, Jesuits from Paris and New York City, Jesuits from Belgium and central Missouri, Jesuits from Lyon in Tampa, El Paso, and New Orleans, Jesuits from Germany on Indian reservations in Dakota Territory, Jesuits from Holland, including the founders of Loyola in Chicago, and all over the country. You see that a little bit in the map. These Jesuits carried the books, journals, devotional pamphlets, architectural drawings, chalices, relics, as we saw downstairs, rosaries, and holy water from a European Catholic world in crisis and translated them into an American idiom. They preached parish missions as they attacked the Republican Party for its anti-Catholicism. Remember, this is the 19th century, not the 20th, 21st. They attacked Catholic University as dangerously liberal while defending the orthodoxy of Georgetown. Again, the 19th century. They became loyal allies and admirers of the 19th century popes, some of whose closest aides included Jesuits fresh from rural Maryland. And along with their allies, priests, nuns, and lay people of similar orientation, they built a Catholic community more attuned to the reverberations of a global church than seemed imaginable in 1816 when Adams and Jefferson fretted. Now, the story of the 19th century Jesuits, I will also argue this evening, orients our understanding of American history. Birthed by the globe's bloodiest civil war, the modern American nation state, along with the modern Italian state, the modern German state, many of the modern Latin American states, emerges in the middle decades of the 19th century. Its leaders desired to form citizens through newly created public schools, urged citizens to express their deepest loyalty to the nation, and align themselves with the promise of modern science. Catholics, and especially Jesuits, seemed to threaten this nationalist project. And at its most intense in the early 1850s, discussion of the threat posed by Jesuits and Catholicism to American society saturated the pages of both the religious and the secular press. Mobs destroyed a dozen Catholic churches across the North in the early 1850s, and anti-Catholic preachers toured the country to large audiences. Members of Congress debated about whether or not to expel the Jesuits from the United States. The anti-Catholic Know Nothing Order and its political wing, the American Party, elected mayors in Boston, Philadelphia, and even Chicago briefly, 8 governors, over 100 congressmen, and thousands of local officials. This tension between Catholics and Protestants in the United States and their antagonism helps explain why Catholics and Protestants became more segregated from and more suspicious of each other during the 19th century, not less. Now, religious polemics in the 19th century did not lead to religious slaughter, a step forward from the Reformation era. But in a time when the heroes of the Reformation, Luther and Calvin for Protestants, More and Ignatius for Catholics, remained vivid to educated men and women, religious divisions, what the German historian Olaf Blaschke calls the new confessional state, fundamentally structured politics and culture. When Jesuits in particular discouraged the use of the King James Bible in the public schools or pleaded with their co-religionists to resist the demands of the federal state, other Americans felt compelled to define the meaning of religious liberty in a more religiously diverse nation. In this sense, the Jesuits and their opponents ignited 19th century versions of the culture wars, some of which flicker into our own time. But all of this is very abstract. So let's enter into our subject more fully with a story, the kind of thing I think that historians do best, and the reason I actually fell in love with this material. Close your eyes. As I said in my class, relax, put down your pens, put down your laptops. Imagine it is October 15th, 1854, and a Jesuit priest named John Baptist has stopped in Ellsworth, Maine, a small shipbuilding town on the coast, to hear confessions. That night, a crowd of about 100 men carrying lanterns and torches surrounds the modest home of a Mr. Kent, an Irish immigrant in Ellsworth, where Baptist was known to be staying. Kent at first denied that Baptist was inside. "We know he is, and we must have him," yelled the mob. Baptist crept into the cellar of the home, closing a trap door behind him. Kent said to the mob, "Look inside. Nobody's here." The mob would not relent. Quote, "If you don't produce him, we will burn down your house and roast him alive." Baptist emerged from the cellar to spare an attack on Kent's home. According to one witness, he still hoped that the instincts of humanity would prevail, but the mob rushed upon him, dragged him 1 mile down the hill toward the river, the Union River, and tied him to a rail. Some of the mob advocated burning Baptist alive. The consensus was to tar and feather him, which the mob did, after stripping him naked, taking his watch, and emptying his wallet. One eyewitness recalled plucking feathers from Baptist's body, the tar and feathering, after a search party had found him, then shaving off his eyebrows and his hair to remove remaining bits of tar. The next day, Baptist said Mass in Ellsworth. Fearful that the mob would gather again, he took refuge in the home of one of Ellsworth's leading citizens, and a Protestant, importantly, I think, who helped hustle him out of Ellsworth and rode with him on the stagecoach to Bangor, as accounts of the attack began filtering out from Maine into the far corners of the United States and the world. Now, how do we explain, here's a photo of our man, Father John Baptist, how do we explain such an odd, disturbing event? First, I'll talk about John Baptist and his role in what we call the Catholic Revival. Then I'll talk about his opponents. And then I'll try to suggest what meaning this event might have for us this evening in this beautiful room at Loyola, and for the project of a more global Catholic history. Baptist was born in 1815 in a small Swiss village. He joined the Jesuits at the age of 20. He spent the next decade studying and teaching at the Jesuit Center in Freiburg, Switzerland, an important center of 19th century Jesuit life. There he absorbed the central intellectual message of the Catholic Revival, including the conviction that the destruction wrought by modern philosophy in the French Revolution had placed Catholics and liberals on an unbridgeable, on the opposite sides, I should say, of an unbridgeable chasm. Baptist's time in Switzerland was ended by the Civil War in Switzerland in 1847, which was between the Protestant and the Catholic cantons. And it was actually a war that stemmed from the Jesuit role in the educational system within Switzerland. Catholic cantons lost the war, and as a result, they were expelled from Switzerland. And Bapst and his fellow seminarians and priests all put on disguises. They were fearful for their lives and fled the country. Now, for Bapst and his Jesuit contemporaries, this forced exile, as a liberal government in Switzerland and then ultimately in other countries, thought Jesuits, as loyal to the papacy as an international religious order, would destroy or damage the project of a nationalist government. This was the first in Switzerland, but it was not the last. Jesuits were expelled from Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Colombia, ultimately 24 countries, beginning in the 1840s and going up to 1900. And as Swiss nationalists denounced the Jesuits in speeches, novels, and poetry, and as mobs looted Jesuit residences, defaced church walls, and destroyed Jesuit libraries, these Jesuits found their suspicions, which they already had, of modernity confirmed. As one Swiss Jesuit explained to a friend who had fled to the United States, "In the name of freedom, the Swiss liberals have driven us out of our country, looted our house, disgraced our churches, desecrated the graves of our brothers." Bapst made his way to Switzerland, and then eventually, along with 60 other Jesuits, so he's part of that migration, and then eventually he made it up to Maine. His work in Maine exemplifies the Catholic revival in 3 ways. The first is his effort, like that of almost every other 19th century Jesuit, to instill what he thought of as basic doctrinal knowledge into populations only loosely connected to the institutional church. Repeatedly in his correspondence, Bapst worried about the, quote, pathetic, end quote, state of the catechesis among Maine's Catholics, the bulk of whom in the late 40s and early 1850s are famine-era Irish migrants and then migrants from Quebec as well. He, quote, announced publicly that not one child will receive his first communion without knowledge of their catechism, end quote, and, quote, we will refuse the future absolution, that is in the confessional, to parents who neglect the religious instruction of their children, end quote. Now, missionaries such as Bapst aimed to foster a more explicit Catholic devotional culture. How do you do that? Their first step was the parish mission. And typically after arriving in a town in Maine, Bapst, and he was usually going with 1 or 2 other Jesuits going through Maine, would organize a mission or a series of meetings for a week, including daily mass, and most importantly in the mission, long hours for Bapst in the confessional. The psychology of the mission pivoted between the doctrinal severity that I just mentioned, centered on the horror of sin and everlasting damnation, and what I would call a practical, even generous piety, aimed at persuading Catholics to view the sacraments and the institutional church as their best protection in a bewildering world. We see the severity in the correspondence, and I could have lots of phrases like this. Bapst viewed missions as, quote, spiritual weapons, end quote, for, quote, reclaiming a very large number of bad Catholics. Hardened sinners must understand that eternal life depended only on reconciliation with the church. We also see the generosity, too, in Bapst's insistence that all could be saved, that any sin could be remedied in the confessional. The Catholic Jesus of the 19th century was more the empathetic sufferer than the judge, more the Jesus of the Sacred Heart than the wise rabbi or teacher. Bapst also focused on other markers of Catholic identity. This seemed especially important to him since, as he recognized, our Catholics, I'm quoting here, live in a nearly exclusively Protestant milieu. Now, Bapst said that many Protestants seemed generally well-disposed toward the Catholic religion, but this made markers of Catholic identity even more important. So Bapst made his conspicuous point of not eating meat on Fridays. He insisted that local parishes deed their parish buildings to the bishop and not to local trustees in a particular town, to emphasize the importance of the institutional church. He was a great devotee, once it became apparent, this is later in the 1860s, of the Lourdes apparition and other apparitions that occurred in France, and talked about that with his parishioners. He was a great enthusiast for the Sacred Heart and almost all the devotions of the Catholic world of the 19th century. Now, the cumulative effect of Bapst's work and those of the thousands of other Jesuits around the world does seem to have been considerable. After a year in Ellsworth, he informed his provincial that only a handful of Catholics in the main towns that he was visiting avoided the parish mission or did not receive communion at Easter. The triumph of grace is miraculous. And indeed, Bapst reported, once Catholics caught the fever, that's my words, not Bapst, They went from door to recruit other great sinners that had not yet repented. Now, the second way in which Baptist exemplified the 19th century Catholic revival was his focus on Catholic education, and even more broadly, the building of self-conscious Catholic institutions. This took two forms. First, Baptist criticized the use of the King James Bible in Ellsworth Tiny Public School. He noted the different wording of the Ten Commandments for Protestants and Catholics, and the general inadequacy in the Catholic view of any Bible without supporting church documents and church interpretive apparatus. So he conceived it his duty to prohibit among his people the reading of the Protestant Bible in the public schools, and instructed the Catholic youth to decline to read the Bible when asked by their teachers to do so. He then organized a petition to protest the use of the King James Bible. The school authorities refused to listen to Baptist and the Irish immigrants in Ellsworth. So then what did he do? He has said he's persuaded the Catholics in the town, we are not going to participate in reading the King James Bible in the public school. He's got together a big petition, takes it to the school board. They say, forget it. Then what? This shows that he's assimilating a little bit to the United States.
He founds a school.
What?
He founds a school.
He founds a school. Ooh, you're ahead of me. Hang on. That was a really good answer, but you should have given that early. Anybody else? He sues. He's assimilated to the United States. There's one Catholic attorney in Ellsworth, and Baptist hires him. And they sue the state of Maine, and they say this is a religious liberty issue. You should not make us, it should not be a requirement that the King James Bible be read in the public schools, indeed read by Catholic school children. Case goes all the way to the Maine Supreme Court. In fact, it's a major religious liberty case that's cited all throughout the 20th century. And Baptist loses. Maine Supreme Court says, quote, only common texts such as the King James Bible can civilize and create Republican citizens, small r Republican citizens, quote, out of immigrant populations. Now, as this dispute accelerates, Baptist does something else. He founds a Catholic school, which I think is what he wanted to do all along. And he says we cannot allow, no public school can ever be religiously neutral. The teachers in the public school, Baptist explained privately, think that our children will become Protestants. We must have our own school despite the endless difficulties that this will present. Now, the third way Baptist exemplifies the ethos of the Catholic revival is more political. His suspicion of the modern nation state. The 19th century, as I mentioned, in Italy, in Germany, in the United States, and much of South America, was a period of intense, often romantic nationalism. Just think, even in Chicago, of the young Abraham Lincoln saluting the power of a nation to mobilize a people. Perhaps no single group on the planet in the middle 19th century is as suspicious of such nationalism as 19th century Jesuits. They thought such sentiments dangerous, a substitution of national loyalties for the priorities of church and family, which seemed to them the organizing building blocks of any good society. That liberal nationalists in Europe and Latin America are willing to eject the Jesuits out of putatively tolerant nation states seems to prove their point. Now, Baptist became a United States citizen in 1856 after the tarring and feathering, 2 years after, but he always worried that America might become as intolerant of a global church as the Italians were in their minds persecution of Pope Pius IX, or the Germans were in the 1870s with the Kulturkampf. Many of Baptist's fellow exiled European Jesuits made a point of not celebrating the 4th of July. Others refused to vote. One exiled Austrian Jesuit in the United States in 1855, just a few months after Baptist was tarred and feathered, dismissed American nationalism as, quote, primitive tribalism. Now, the American Civil War would force Jesuits to ally themselves with both the North and the South, but they did with both the North and the South. And it didn't end the suspicion of modern nationalism. As one Italian Jesuit exile complained, these American priests, by this he means diocesan priests, by praising the founding fathers such as Adams and Jefferson and Washington too much, they think they will win popular respect, which they are too much influenced by. Now, that's Baptist. Why did Ellsworth residents react so violently to Baptist? The passions that provoke the attack on Baptist are actually not limited to the United States. Instead, there are religious and ideological currents from across the Atlantic colliding in the unlikely locale of Ellsworth. The pivotal local figure in Ellsworth was the editor of the town newspaper, a guy named William Cheney, who filled his newspaper with anti-Catholic columns and attacks, even the occasional cartoon. As Bapt noted, quote, the bigots of Ellsworth, and among them the editor of the Ellsworth Herald, that's Cheney, indulged in all kinds of abuses, outrages, slanders, and abominations against the church and me and the Catholics and chiefly the converts, end quote. Now, Cheney was kind of slashing and crude, but even Ellsworth's more solid citizens respected Cheney's basic message. The town's leading minister, the Congregational Church, who had been in Ellsworth for 40 years, worried that, quote, Catholicism is an old, worn-out institution. It is behind the age. For 50 years, the various Catholic countries of Europe have been disgorging upon our shores her tens and hundreds of thousands of paupers and criminals. And a wave of orators, speakers, and writers crossed from Europe, just as the Jesuits are crossing from Europe, to the United States to preach this message about the dangers of Catholicism. I'll just mention two. One is a guy named Alessandro Gavazzi, an Italian who was an ex-priest, who was a very active participant in the Italian Revolution of 1848. He tours England and Scotland and then tours the United States to massive crowds. And his basic message is watch out for the Jesuits. The Jesuits are the leaders of Catholicism. They don't believe in the nation state. They don't believe in the Bible and the public schools. Quote, with the Bible and the Bible alone, this is Gavazzi, the American people will flourish. And I will say to them, remember, it was the Bible and the Bible alone which made your freedom. That is, so don't let the Jesuits take the Bible out of the public schools. Jesuits, exiles, Gavazzi specifically said, seemed an obvious threat to American liberty, and he urged Americans to follow the example of the Italian government and expel the Jesuits from the United States. All of Gavazzi's lectures were reprinted in the Ellsworth Herald and avidly, we are told, discussed. Another example, Boston's Theodore Parker, the great liberal minister of the 1850s, the great anti-slavery advocate, probably the most prominent liberal, almost radical minister of the 1850s. Parker lectured to Bangor and Ellsworth residents for 2 consecutive evenings in the spring of 1854, just 4 months before the attack on Bapst. Quote, Jesuits, he warned, come in abundance. Some are known, others stealthily prowl about the land, all the more dangerous in their disguise. He added, the Catholic Church opposes everything which favors democracy and the natural rights of man. It hates our free churches, it hates our free press, and it hates our free schools. So that's the Jesuits. That's their opponents. What about Bapst? After his tarring and feathering, Bapst continued to work as an administrator and parish priest in cities on the eastern seaboard. As Jim O'Toole knows, where's Jim? Okay, as Jim O'Toole knows, some people would identify Bapst as the founder of Boston College. And a library there, the Bapst Library, and a high school in Bangor still carry his name. His name entered Catholic histories and textbooks as a suffering victim of intolerance. This is kind of funny. The most prominent early historian of Catholicism, a guy named John Gilmary Shea, wrote Bapst a week after he's tarred and feathered and said, I'm going to need a personal account of this for my next book. A little chilling as a historian to read that. In his old age, Bapst grew a long white beard that was, quote, fit for a holy patriarch. An account circulated of his ability to heal the sick through his prayers or even to predict the future. During his last years, he struggled to distinguish, quote, between dream and reality, occasionally waking up in horror as he replayed that night in Ellsworth so long ago. I think this story allows us to see 2 milieus, one Protestant or post-Protestant, and in the North at least, increasingly focused on individual liberty. This concern meant that Catholics could be seen as a threat to liberty as they challenge or try to gain influence in the public schools. That's one. On the other hand are Catholics, and especially Jesuits, who come out of the 19th century more convinced than ever that they need to foster communal solidarity to protect themselves. And so they mobilize around mission campaigns, which carry a sense of the church as distinct from all Protestant denominations, and a determination to bind Catholics through the sacraments and through the institutional church to a shared sense of a global institution. They worry that nation-states, such as the United States, will substitute national for religious loyalties. And they emphasize the Pope as a symbol of Catholic unity to link Catholics in the United States to Catholics from around the world. Some of the Jesuits that Bapst knew very well as European exiles in the United States go back to Rome in the 1860s and play an important role in the Declaration of Papal Infallibility in 1870. And there's probably no declaration that offers a sharper contrast between liberal understandings of national loyalty and autonomy with a Catholic focus on solidarity and an independent religious authority. Now, viewed comparatively, the 19th century Jesuits and the Catholicism they favored seems less an anti-modern exception and more of a global rule. Generally, there hasn't been that much written about the 19th century Jesuits, I think, because they were seen as sort of a theological detour on the road to the Second Vatican Council. But when you think about it, the world's great religious traditions, including Protestant and Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Roman Catholicism, all became more self-conscious about doctrine and uniformity of practice during the 19th century as new modes of travel and communication brought people into unprecedented proximity. Writing this more global history, a history of religion, global history of many other things, now seems to me one of the most important historical projects of the current moment. Perhaps even as important as social history to the 1960s and 1970s, cultural history to the 1980s and 1990s. Like all such fashions or swerves in disciplinary thinking, it reverberates with the world around us. It reflects the fact that we can walk out of this room and go to a Walgreens and buy an object that was made in China about 6 weeks ago, or that we can read local papers on the internet from around the world, or that we can have Facebook friends all over the globe. Now, like all such trends, global history has its perils, and we could talk later about the problem of causation in global history and the difficulty of having the local and the global together. But I do think it provides a professional opportunity, maybe even a professional obligation, for historians, like the historians in this room, interested in Catholicism. To put it bluntly, for the world since, say, 1500, Catholicism is indisputably the world's most important, most multilingual, and most multicultural institution. Full stop. And indeed, religious ideas and institutions are among the most globalized of the modern era. Again, I think the 19th century Jesuits, if at once, with their loyalty to the papacy, their suspicion of nationalism, their enthusiasm for papal infallibility, seemed a bit of a detour toward the Second Vatican Council. But now, Manila matters toward the future of Catholicism more than Milan, Kampala more than Cologne. This is in part an achievement of Baptist and his missionary peers. These men did not share the sensitivity that we might have toward enculturation, and their architectural drawings, devotional practices, and Latin textbooks conceded little to local context. Similarly, their repeated attacks on modernity and their deep hesitations about both democracy and religious liberty did not well equip them for the challenges of the 20th century. But their orientation to the world, their linguistic curiosity, and their willingness to move across national boundaries seems oddly contemporary. The career of a Jesuit, who I tracked in a different project that won't be in this book, expelled from Sicily in 1848, who moved to Ireland, then to Spain, then to the Philippines, and then to France before ending his career in New Mexico. That career resembles that of a contemporary management consultant or international aid worker. His life and work was bounded less by a nation state and more by a global Catholic community. Now, this Catholic globalism, like globalism generally, has its own history. My own view is that it peaks in the 19th century, it declines in the era around World War I, when hundreds, thousands of Jesuits actually volunteer for service with nationalist armies, and then surges forward again in the wake of the Second World War and decolonization. A new peak after the mid-19th century is reached at the Second Vatican Council. And probably the most cited essay ever written on the Second Vatican Council was written by a German Jesuit, Karl Rahner, delivered in German, I am told, in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1978, in which Rahner said the most important thing to know about the Council is that it signified the emergence of a global church in a fully official way. In the 19th century, Rahner said, the church exported a European religion as a commodity it did not want to change. Now it's different. The primary achievement of the Council had been to translate the liturgy into the vernacular, and a global Catholic sensibility was emerging. After all, in the middle of the 20th century, the single largest group of Jesuits came from the United States. Since the 1980s, the single largest group has come from South Asia. The most famous of the world's Jesuits, of course, is now Jorge Bergoglio, or Pope Francis, an Argentine Jesuit whose story fits into this a little bit. Born of Italian immigrants at the very last gasp of that European migration out from Europe into the New World. So his parents were Italian immigrants. Or as he explained with a smile to the throng in St. Peter's Square on the evening of his election, a pope from the end of the earth. Francis repeatedly invokes as models those Jesuits willing to immerse themselves in the culture of people distant from themselves, including, he gave a long interview which had a special section on a Spanish Jesuit who spent his career in Alaska. As you know, he has installed an informal cabinet of 8 cardinals representing 7 continents. When he speaks of, quote, a globalization of indifference, end quote, marking the current divide between rich and poor, he injects Catholic social thought into more ebullient discussions of the theoretically flat global economy. Even now, much of the Catholic world, in the United States and around the globe, is monitoring the debates at the Synod on the Family. How this new era of Catholic globalization will work is not entirely clear, but Catholic connections and communities, now forged by text messages and Skype, necessarily follow the paths laid by John Baptist and his peers. And as today's Catholics absorb Francis's charge to wake up the world, these tales from the 19th century, including the one you have listened so patiently to this evening, may possess an unexpected resonance. Thank you.